So, quick things first. Remember that paper 1 is due tonight, right? So before we get into anything else, does anybody have any questions about the paper? Everybody's good? Okay. So for Thursday, then you're going to be reading the Gandhi essay in Reading the World, Economic and Moral Progress, pages 401 to 408, and you'll also be going back to doing the vocab words, right? So just make sure that you get me 3 words you had to look up in the vocab folder for Thursday night. Okay, so I'll just give you guys a minute to take all this down, to think of any questions if you have them, and then we'll get started talking about Confucius and related issues. Everybody good? All right, great. So, for the next couple of sessions, our primary subject is going to be the idea of justice, right? What does justice mean? What does justice look like? How do we envision, a just society, a just economy, a just way of life, right? So when I put this word up here on the board, right, when I give you a word like justice, what do you think justice means? How would you define this word? What does it mean for something to be just, or for someone to be just?
I mean, the first thing I think of when I hear justice is like when someone commits a crime or something like that. They're punished, or they're told what to do after that.
Okay, so we associate the word with law and with legality, right? Okay. Good. What else? What other things do we think of when we think about the idea of justice? Is this a word that we only use in legal contexts?
No, that's what you mainly hear.
Yeah, at least in official discourse, yeah, we mostly talk about justice in terms of, whether, and, okay, if we're going down this legal road, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's just continue down this path. Is justice, the idea of justice, limited to, say, individual action? The individual did something unjust or illegal, so they must be punished. Where does the idea of justice come in when somebody breaks the law?
I think of it in my head, but I explain it. It's brought to justice, or it's brought to justice. That's why I thought about it.
Okay. Someone being brought to justice. Yeah, so yeah, we use that as a kind of metaphor, right? Mm-hmm. For someone who has committed a crime being apprehended, right? Mm-hmm. So someone having to face justice, right? Okay. So I think that we're thinking about it here primarily in contexts relating to punishment, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when we think about being, like somebody being punished for a crime, right? Do we think that, like, say, somebody being sentenced to 15 years in prison for having a dime bag of marijuana on them, right? Do we regard that as just? They've broken the law,
Yeah.
but the punishment seems disproportionate to what they did, right? So we also think about justice not just in terms of whether someone is punished for committing a crime, right? But also in terms of whether the punishment they receive is fair. So we also tend to think about justice in terms of fairness, right? So in a lot of ways, what we're talking about here, if we extend this out a little bit more broadly to conversations beyond the legal system, right? If we want to talk about, say, like economic justice, right? What would economic justice look like? What do you think economic justice would mean?
Like, everyone lives the same, everyone is paid the same, stuff like that. Like, it's equal.
Okay, yeah, so we can think of that in terms of equality, right? So if we're talking about what's just, do we think that everybody should be getting paid the same amount of money no matter what it is they do? Because we also tend to take into account things like seniority, right? Things like the difficulty of a particular job, level of danger, and how much education it requires to do the job, right? So it's maybe less about coming up with, a single amount to pay everyone, right? And perhaps more about figuring out what's a fair price for a particular job, like what's a fair wage for a particular job. And I think maybe what you were thinking of, Elizabeth, where do we tend to see inequality in wages for people who are doing the same job? Where do we tend to see that most frequently?
Like, not really like corporate jobs, just like, kind of like jobs teenagers would have. Because it's like, they're all doing the same job.
Okay, yeah. So there is in every state in the U.S. a minimum wage, right? That this is what you have to pay everyone. And yeah, so if everybody's doing the same job, right,
They get paid the
then they should get paid the same amount. If they're doing the same job with the same level of experience, right, we consider it just that they're all paid the same amount, right? But I think if we take that outside of that kind of job, right? If we're looking at, say, like a big corporation, do women often get paid as much as men for doing the same job? Yeah, there's a big gender pay gap, right? So that is also a potential issue. Of economic justice, though I will admit that it is often hard to feel bad for people who are making six-figure salaries when one person makes a higher six-figure salary than another, right? At the same time, we do tend to think that people who are doing the same job should get the same amount of money if they have commensurate experience, right? We also tend to, like, if we think about the value of particular jobs as well, right, within society, what types of jobs tend to get paid less?
like the ones that everyone can do.
Okay, low-skilled labor tends to get low pay, right? But if we're thinking about jobs that actually do require, say, a college degree, right?
Like I like how education, it's like the higher your degree or more years you do, it goes up.
Yeah, so if you have, like, say, a master's degree, right, and you're a public school teacher, you make more money than someone who doesn't, right? And we wouldn't necessarily consider that unfair, right? Because you've made an investment in more education.
Yeah.
You probably have more content knowledge. So, thus we consider it more or less fair that we're just that someone with more education get paid more. But if we look at the amount of money teachers make generally compared to the amount of value they add to society, right? That's a little bit off balance, right? Professions like teacher and social worker, for example, even though they often require advanced degrees and are socially useful, often pay very little, right? And I'm not necessarily saying that you should think that teachers and social workers should be paid more, right? I think they should be, but that doesn't mean you have to, right? You don't have to agree with me. What I am saying, like, these are the kinds of issues that we think about when we talk about justice and what a just society looks like, right? This idea of balance between what you do for society, right? What you put into society and what you get out of it, right? So let's try to turn our attention now to Confucius and the excerpt from the Analects I wanted you guys to read. How did this go for you? What did you guys think of this?
Page is it on? I forgot.
Pardon?
What page is it on? I forgot.
Hold on a second. Okay, so it starts on page 436.
I like how he was like, where the part where it does the line across and all that stuff up underneath it on 437. I like how he does that. It just adds more to it. Instead of him just like speaking all the time, it's like what other people say.
Okay. Yeah, so most of these little blurbs here, right, are imaginary conversations between Confucius
And other people do.
and either his students or rulers who are seeking his advice, right? So, to give you a little bit of context for this and for what's going on here, right? So, there is no kind of like single sustained argument here, right? There's no consistent narrative, although, there are certain themes that pop up again and again in each of these little conversations, right? So, Confucius lived in a period in Chinese history known as the Spring and Autumn period. So, most historians regard this as lasting from 771 to 476 BCE. And what this period is is a long, slow decline in centralized authority, right? So it comes at the end of an imperial dynasty called Cao. Which ends around 476 BCE. And essentially what's happening is that the emperor and his court lose control of the country, right? And it breaks up into a bunch of semi-independent states, the lords of which are all very much concerned with getting ahead on their own and aren't concerned with where they rank in relation to the emperor. They aren't concerned with the overall good of the nation. They're concerned with what's going on in their particular state and in making their state dominant, right? So, in this climate, a group of independent contractors, I guess, would be the closest equivalent today, who call themselves Shi. Shi in Chinese means man of skill, or person of skill. And these Shi hire themselves out to different rulers to give them advice, right, on how to run their states, and not just how to run their individual states, but also how to get ahead of other states, right? How to make their states dominant.
Yeah.
So probably, like, the closest equivalent today would be like when a business hires a consultant to give them advice on something that, no one who works there actually does. So Confucius is really critical of all of this. He doesn't like these itinerant philosophers going around selling their services, pretending that they're acting for the good of a particular state. He doesn't like that the rulers of these different states no longer respect the emperor. He doesn't like that there's a big leadership vacuum emerging in Chinese society, right? So what he does is kind of come up with a system that's intended to reinforce respect for authority. And in addition to reinforcing respect for authority, is also supposed to make people very much concerned about the relationships with each other, right, within a particular community. So Confucianism is in a lot of ways what we call an invented tradition. So this is a term that's coined by the historian Eric Hobsbawm. And let's see if you can come up with a definition for this. What do you think invented tradition means? What do you think an invented tradition is?
I mean, like, everyone has their tradition, and there's like the ones that like everyone knows about. I think maybe he just invents his own tradition for people to follow.
Okay, yeah, so that whole thing, invented, like, suggests in some way false or not genuine, right? And that's partially true when we talk about invented traditions, right? Like, one good example of this, one of the examples Hobsbawm himself cites is, so you know how, like, in Scotland, right, there are these different plaid patterns that people wear on kilts that are all supposed to be associated with particular, clans or families, right? Yeah. Each family is supposed to have their own plaid tartan. And people act as though this is a tradition that's old, that stretches back into ancient times, right? Mm-hmm. That, the, old Scottish Celts, when they were running around in the Highlands, were doing this. But the fact is, this is actually a really new practice that was invented by a novelist named Walter Scott in the early 19th century, right? So when we talk about an invented tradition, what we're talking about is taking something that's new, right? that's actually an innovation and making it look like it's old. Making it look like it's something people have, like it's a revival of something people have been doing for centuries, right? And that's kind of what Confucius does, right? He creates what's essentially a new system of thought, but he makes it look like it's a return to traditional Chinese values. So let's try to dig into some of these little sayings here. So another thing to remember about Confucius and about the Analects specifically is that Confucius himself never actually, as far as we know, didn't write down a word of this. These are recollections of his teachings collected by his students after his death. So, if we look on page 437, and the first of these little sayings, right? Can I get somebody to read for us? The master said, "He who exercises government."
I will.
Thank you.
You want me to read all of it or just that one?
Just that top one.
The master said, "He who exercises government by means of his virtue may be compared to the North Polar Star, which keeps its place and all the stars turn towards it."
Okay, so let's think about this analogy here, right? What's being compared to what?
Someone who does government by like his own virtue is compared to the North Polar Star.
Okay. Yes, this leader who leads by virtue is compared to the North Star, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what is special about the North Star? What's unusual about the North Star?
It stays in its place.
Yeah.
People look at like the guide the north.
Exactly. It's used as a navigation point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a fixed point in the sky.
It never changes.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, it's not actually the sky that's moving, it's actually us that are moving, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the North Star never moves, never changes its position in relation to us, right? So it's a fixed point, right? It's reliable, and the rest of the sky appears to move around it. So what is Confucius suggesting in this metaphor about how virtue works in a leader?
It makes them look better, I guess, or something like that.
Pardon?
Makes them look better.
Okay, yeah. Does a virtuous leader in this analogy need to do anything to the people apart from setting a good example? Yeah, the basic idea here, right, is that if you lead with virtue, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you demonstrate virtue to your subjects, they'll fall in line and follow and circle around you, and you don't have to force them, right? So Confucius seems to regard virtue as this almost kind of magnetic property. Right? A leader who is virtuous will naturally exert a pull, and the people will fall in line, right? Now, it probably would help if we try to figure out what exactly Confucius means by virtue here, too, right? Because this is another one of those words Exactly, that can mean multiple things in different contexts, right? So, like, if we think back to Seneca early in the semester, right? Seneca was specifically thinking about certain qualities of manliness when he was thinking about virtue, right? Confucius is talking about something else. So, I think what we need to try to deal with here is what exactly Confucius thinks virtue is, right? So, can I get somebody to continue on here to read the next one here? The master said, if people be led by laws. Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
The master said, if the people be led by laws and uniformity sought to be given them by punishment, they will try to avoid the punishment, but have no sense of shame. If they be led by virtue and uniformity sought to be given by the new rules of
Propriety.
They will have a sense of shame and moreover will become good.
Okay, so the Chinese word for propriety, or that's translated here as propriety, is li. Now, li also more properly means ritual. And I think if we think about this in terms of a ritual, then we can tease out what Confucius means when he talks about propriety, right? So I think we discussed this a little bit when we talked about Mencius and Sun Tzu earlier in the semester, right? But what exactly is a ritual?
I feel like it's something you do every like certain event happens.
Okay.
Just like football teams have rituals, or like other teams, or like certain groups have rituals they do before something they do during.
Okay, yeah, so different social groups follow particular practices, right, that are always the same. You know, whether it's, you know, say like, a sports team having a prayer in the locker room before the game, right?
Yeah.
Or, getting into a huddle to pump themselves up or something like that, right? The point being that everyone participates and everyone has a particular role in it, right? We think about rituals in terms of religion, right? A marriage ritual or a funeral ritual, right? These have multiple participants, and everybody has a prescribed role in the ceremony, right? And what happens in a ritual if one person doesn't do the thing they're supposed to do?
It's not the same.
Yeah, the whole thing is screwed up, right? So what we mean when we talk about propriety and ritual in a Confucian context is appropriate social behavior, right? Doing the thing within your prescribed social role that you're supposed to do, so that everything runs smoothly, right? So to go back, to this passage that Ron read, right? If the people be led by laws, and uniformity sought to be given by them by punishments, they will try to avoid the punishment, but have no sense of shame. If they be led by virtue, and uniformity sought to be given them by the rules of propriety, they will have the sense of shame, and moreover will become good. So how effective does Confucius think legal punishments are in actually reforming people's behavior?
Makes them feel bad. Like they can better understand what they've done wrong, instead of just nothing being done.
What helps them understand what they've done wrong? Does giving someone a legal punishment make them understand what they've done wrong?
Not really. It's just
So I think what he sets up here is a difference here, like a kind of binary between punishment and shame, right? Whereas punishment is something that's done to you, right?
Yeah.
It's like, you didn't do the reading, so I'm gonna smack you upside the head, right? Which I'm not. I can't do that, right? And I shouldn't. But that's an example. So punishment is something that's done to you to penalize you for either failing to do something you should have done or for doing something you shouldn't have done, right? So what's shame? How is shame different from punishment?
You're not really punished. You're just like, it just makes you feel really bad. Like I know in like Chinese culture, like they like honor to the family. When you do something
Sure.
that disgraces the family, they're like, you just like know not to do that in your family. Like, you know to always act a certain way and not do anything that could like bring shame to your family.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes out of Confucian ideas and Confucian tradition, and how diffused that's become through that particular society. But I think the feeling we're talking about when we talk about shame, right? Have you ever had that situation? It's like where you've done something wrong, and all your parents say is, "I'm very disappointed in you," and then they won't talk to you for a little while. Right? They don't do anything to you, right? They don't ground you. They don't take away any of your privileges. They just say they're disappointed in you, right?
Yeah.
And the basic idea that Confucius seems to be communicating here, right, is that feels worse. Right? Knowing that you've stepped out of bounds and are, thus socially sanctioned feels worse than being thrown in prison or, whacked with a board or something like that, right? The punishment, once it's over, right? Shame as an internal feeling is harder to erase. So fear of punishment, he's suggesting, is not an adequate motivator for people to behave virtuously. If you want them to behave virtuously, it has to come from within, not from without. You have to spark a feeling within them. So following along the same lines, let's look at the next passage here. Can I get somebody to read this next and start with the Duke I saying?
I will.
Thank you.
The Duke I asked, saying, "What should be done in order to secure the submission of the people?" Confucius replied, "Advance the upright and set aside the crooked, then the people will submit. Advance the crooked and set aside the upright, then the people will not submit." What is that?
Kang.
Kang asked how to cause people to reverence their ruler, to be faithful to him, and to go on to nerve themselves to virtue. The master said, "Let him preside over them with gravity. Then they will reverence him. Let him be final and kind to all. Then they will be faithful to him. Let him advance the good and teach the incompetent. Then they will eagerly seek to be virtuous."
Okay, so there are two parts to this one, right? So let's start with the Duke I's question. What is the Duke I asking of Confucius?
How do you get submission out of someone?
Yeah,
Or
how
out
do
of
you
people?
secure the submission of the people, right? So what does it sound like he's asking for if he wants to secure the submission of the people? What kind of answer do you think he wants from Confucius?
Give them order.
What's that?
Give them order.
Yeah, order, right? And if you're asking someone to submit,
Like they just don't say anything, they just go along with what you want.
pardon?
Like they just go along with what the leader wants or ruler. Just don't really, they don't like, they comply but they don't say anything like, "Oh, this is wrong," or
Yeah, so that there's an element here, like not just of order, but also of force or coercion, right? Right? How do I make the people obey me? Is another way you might phrase this particular question, right? And it doesn't say how he responds to Confucius's answer, but do we get the impression that Confucius gives him the answer he wants?
yeah.
Yeah, this sounds like he's asking for some kind of military solution here, right?
Like, he gives them the answer, but then he gives them other ways to do it.
Yeah. And that have less to do with a specific action, right? Advance the upright and set aside the crooked, then the people will submit. Advance the crooked and set aside the upright, then the people will not submit. So how is he suggesting that the people will know whether he's a good leader or not?
Like who he advances and helps.
Yeah, the company he keeps, right? Who he promotes and who he demotes, right? Who do you hire or promote?
Yeah.
If you bring on board good people who are honest and virtuous, the people will see that and submit. If you move up people who are selfish and corrupt, then the people will not submit to you, right? The people will know you by the company you keep.
Yeah.
And this actually gets at a kind of key Confucian value, right? That the community is more important than the individual. This doesn't mean that the individual is not important, right? Or that people have no individualism in this system. What it does mean is that everyone's life is better if you are following the role you are supposed to in the community, and if you're thinking about the community and not just yourself in every decision that you make, right? So if we're working towards here any kind of definition of justice, right? One notion of justice that we might get out of this is what's good or what's best for everyone. So let's follow on to the one on the bottom of the page here, right? Ron, can you read that out for us? Let me just quickly check on the time. See, okay, we got time. Go ahead.
When a country is well governed, in a mean condition are things to be ashamed of. When a country is ill governed, riches and honor are things to be ashamed of.
Okay, stop there because I think that's the important part of this, right? When a country is well governed, poverty and a mean condition are things to be ashamed of. When a country is ill governed, riches and honor are things to be ashamed of. What does this mean? If your country is well run and well governed, and you are still poor,
People ask, like, why are you poor? If, like, everyone else is, like, fine and stuff like that.
yeah, so where does Confucius seem to be laying the blame there?
To the, not the leader, but, like, the people that are poor.
Yeah, in this case, if your country is being being led well and is prosperous and virtuous, and you are poor and in a mean or petty condition, right? It means you've stepped out of line. When a country is ill-governed, riches and honors are things to be ashamed of. What does that mean?
Why do you have all this money but nobody else does?
Yeah. This is a shitty, disorganized state. Everybody else is poor. Why are you rich, right? So the key thing linking these two ideas, right, is what? What do they have in common with each other?
Leadership.
Okay, leadership, yep. And what else? What have the individuals singled out in both of these examples done wrong? Think about it in these terms of appropriate social behavior and the importance of community here, right?
Like they haven't gone out of their way to help or like get help.
Yeah. Essentially, they've disconnected themselves from the community, right? And this disconnection from others is regarded here as a kind of social ill, right?
Mm-hmm.
As the cause of social ills. Okay, so I'd like to look at a couple of these that deal with the issue of virtue in particular, so we can try to get a decent definition of this. So the word that Confucius uses to describe a particularly virtuous person is junci, which in Chinese means superior person. So a junci is a person who engages in constant self-improvement to try to make himself or herself a worthy participant in the community, right? When he talks about a mean or petty person, he's talking about the opposite of this, right?
Yeah.
So mean here doesn't necessarily mean nasty or unpleasant. Mean means someone who is petty and selfish. And this board is too tiny. So page 438, Yan Yuan asked about perfect virtue. The master said, to subdue oneself and return to propriety is perfect virtue. If a man can for one day subdue himself and return to propriety, and under heaven will ascribe perfect virtue to him. Is the practice of perfect virtue from a man himself, or is it from others? Yan Yuan said, I beg to ask the steps of that process. The master replied, look not at what is contrary to propriety. Listen not to what is contrary to propriety. Speak not what is contrary to propriety. Make no movement which is contrary to propriety. Yan Yuan then said, though I am deficient in intelligence and vigor, I will make it my business to practice this lesson. Chung Kung asked about perfect virtue. The master said, it is, when you go abroad, to behave to everyone as if you were receiving a great guest, to employ the people as if you were assisting at a great sacrifice, not to do to others as you would not wish done to yourself, to have no murmuring against you in the country and none in the family. Chung Kung said, though I am deficient in intelligence and vigor, I will make it my business to practice this lesson. So, I want you to look at these for a minute and think about whether Confucius gives Yan Yuan and Chung Kung the same answer. And just look it over, think about it for a minute, and when you think you've got something, speak up.
He tells the second guy that like he gives more of a direct answer.
Okay.
Like what he's like, it is, and then he explains it. But then with the first one, he kind of gives like, he gives an answer, but it's like vague. It's like it can be something like he could take it in a different meaning in what Confucius is meaning.
Okay. So let's try to boil that down a little bit. What is he telling Yan Yuan? Is he telling Yan Yuan what to do?
Yes. Like he's like yes and no.
Okay, yes and no. Right? Look not at what is contrary to propriety. Listen not to what is contrary to propriety. Is he telling him what to do or what not to do? Yeah, so his instructions to Yan Yuan are expressed in terms of negatives, right? Don't do this.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the thread that runs through all of the instructions that he gives to Yan Yuan? What is Yan Yuan not supposed to do?
To either not look, listen, and movement or speak to like what which is contrary to propriety.
Right, so if he's not supposed to do anything that's contrary to propriety, right? What is he telling Yan Yuan is the most important element of virtue? What does Yan Yuan need to do in all of his actions, in all of his words? Remember what's meant here by propriety, right? What does Confucius mean by propriety? I hope it doesn't rain. I hope it doesn't rain.
It does not.
So remember that in Chinese, the word that would be used here is li. What did li mean in addition to propriety?
Not virtue.
Right. Propriety, ritual, social appropriateness, right? So what he is telling Yan Yuan perfect virtue is, right, is to do and say only what is socially appropriate.
Yeah.
Right? Don't step out of bounds. Now then if we go to what he tells Chung Kung in the following paragraph, what does he tell Chung Kung virtue is?
It's whenever you treat everyone as if they're like a guest to you,
Uh-huh.
or it's basically the saying like, don't do to someone that you wouldn't want to do to yourself, or like treat others like how you'd want to be treated.
Yeah. In fact, Confucius is the first thinker to use that particular phrase, right? It pops up in basically every other religious system in the world, right? That is like one of the few single elements that just about every religious philosophy has in common. This idea of doing unto other people as you would want them to do to you. But there's a different angle here when he's talking about Chung Kung, right? So he told Yan Yuan what not to do, right? And that Yan Yuan should do and the suggestion is that he should do only what's socially appropriate. The instructions to Chung Kung, on the other hand, are expressed in terms of positives, right? This is what you should do. And they also, I think, suggest a different social level, right? Receiving a great guest, employing the people as if you're assisting at a great sacrifice, to have no murmuring against you in the country or in the family, right? So the advice to Yan Yuan is the kind of advice you would give to someone who is a social subordinate, right? somebody who's in a subordinate position.
That bird is loud.
That bird is very loud, yes. It's getting slightly annoying. But yeah, I guess that's, spring and the animal mating dance and all that fun stuff. So yeah, so the instructions he gives to Yen Yuan are the kinds of instructions one gives to a subordinate, right? Somebody who's in a lower social position.
Yeah.
Whereas the instructions he gives to Chung Kung suggest someone of higher status, right? They're concerned with generosity, hospitality, and management. So, what Chung Kung is learning from Confucius is a concept that in Chinese is called shu, which means, no, it doesn't mean benevolence. Reciprocity, right? You will get back from people what you give to them. And this seems to be something that he thinks is particularly important for a leader to learn, right? That what you give to the people is what they will give back to you. Now, what do we notice about the responses, though, that Yen Yuan and Chung Kung both give to Confucius after he teaches them what perfect virtue is for them? So we can say the perfect virtue seems to be relative, right, to whatever your position is in society. What do we make of their responses to Confucius? What do we notice about them?
They say the same thing.
Yeah, they both say the same thing, right?
They say they want to practice.
Yeah. I will make it my business to practice this lesson. And what do they both say before they say they will make it their business to practice this lesson?
Though I'm deficient in intelligence and vigor.
Yeah. So they both make this kind of modest, humble claim about themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Before saying that they will practice this lesson. So one thing that tells us is that this is probably a kind of formulaic response, right? You know, when somebody tries to teach you something, this is apparently what you are supposed to say.
Yeah.
But even though they're clearly at different social positions, what does it suggest about how they regard Confucius that they both say the same thing? They both use this very deferential phrase. Where do they see Confucius as ranking in comparison to themselves?
Even though like in different social rankings, they think the same.
Pardon?
Even though they're like in different social rankings, they think the same. Even though they're told something different.
Sure. But I think that what I'm trying to get at here is, what does this suggest that they think about Confucius in relation to themselves? So Yen Yuan seems to be of a lower social rank than Chung Kung, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does Chung Kung seem to regard himself as being on the same level or the same rank as Confucius? Yeah, he seems to regard the teacher and the man of learning, right,
Yeah.
as a greater authority figure than himself. So we can see here that virtue, one of the reasons why virtue seems to be so hard to pin down here is that on the one hand it does seem to kind of mean different things for different people, at least in terms of specific actions, right?
Mm-hmm.
The subordinate like Yen Yuan needs to sit back, pay attention, and learn. The person in the superior position like Chung Kung needs to put these principles into practice, but the principles themselves are the same, right? The main principle that underlies all of Confucius' thought is reciprocity. To give you an example of this, on page 439, Kang, distressed about the number of thieves in the state, inquired of Confucius how to do away with them. Confucius said, "If you, sir, were not covetous, although you should reward them to do it, they would not steal." So what is Confucius telling Kang about the reason there are so many thieves in his state?
His fault.
Yeah, it's your fault. And why? Why is it Kang's fault there are thieves in the state?
Because he should reward them.
Pardon?
He should reward them? Or is it because he's covetous?
Yeah, do we know what covetous means? Okay, covetous means greedy. So what he's telling Kang here, right, is like, if you weren't greedy, then the people in your state wouldn't steal.
Yeah.
Right? They steal because you set a bad example. Kang asked Confucius about government, saying, "What do you say to killing the unprincipled for the good of the principle?" Confucius replied, "Sir, in carrying on your government, why should you use killing at all? Let your evinced desires be for what is good, and the people will be good. The relation between superiors and inferiors is like that between the wind and the grass. The grass must bend when the wind blows across it." So he's still talking here about leading by example, right?
Yeah.
What does this simile at the end of this mean, right? The relation between superiors and inferiors is like that between the wind and the grass. The grass must bend when the wind blows across it.
They go together. It's just like the grass stands up straight and the wind's blowing. It's like they flow together.
Yeah. The grass has no choice but to move when the wind blows, right? The two move as one. They move in unison. Good. And if the grass has to move with the wind anyway, right? Then the wind should at least be providing a good example. Should be moving in good directions rather than bad or ill directions. So, one last thing, and then we'll, I'll let you ask any questions, then we'll let you go, right? If we look on page 441, there's this long set of short quotations that looks kind of almost like the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew, right? It's just like a series of sayings that kind of, some of them kind of build on each other, right?
Yeah.
The master said, "The superior man is distressed by his want of ability. He is not distressed by men's not knowing him." What does this mean?
He wants to be able to do things. He doesn't really care.
Pardon?
For men not knowing what he does. He'd rather be able to do stuff and he doesn't really care who knows it.
Exactly, yeah. So this is another theme that runs through a lot of these, right? Is that desire for personal fame is something that he places on the mean or petty side of the scale, right? Whereas genuine self-improvement goes on the Junzi side of the scale. Right. This is what the superior person is concerned with. Right. Making themselves better.
Yeah.
Making themselves smarter. Making themselves more benevolent and compassionate. Not with making themselves better known. And I think, again, like the big problem here with this desire for fame, right, is that it's ultimately selfish. So, if we want to bring this back around to the notion of justice that we started with here, right, I think it would be fair to say that for Confucius, justice means putting the needs of the community ahead of your own. No, you're not even that. Like, not just putting the needs of the community ahead of your own. Let me rephrase that. Recognizing how your needs are tied to the needs of the community, right? We can see this when he's talking about how leaders should get the people to submit, right? If you're making them submit by using force, then you're just behaving selfishly because you want them to listen to you. If you actually want to live in a good and virtuous community, you lead them by example instead. And injustice, for Confucius, seems to be tied to both selfishness and alienation from others. Right. The just man walks with others. The unjust man walks by himself. So do you guys have any questions about any of this stuff? I think we're at about, at least since we started a little early, we're at about time. And I'm starting to get a little bit worried about that sky. So we'll let you go. Remember to read the Gandhi for next time. And the paper is due tonight, right?
Yep.
Okay. See you Thursday.